Hi everyone, my name is Frede and today I'm going to be doing the Arts Movements book tag, I believe it's called, which was created by Miriam over at Between Lines and Life. She also tagged me in it. It's a fantastic tag that sort of combines art movements and books. Two amazing things, you know, visual art, books, perfect. So thank you very much for tagging me. Some of these questions were quite difficult, but I'm quite excited to answer these questions, so let's get into it. The first art movement is Baroque, and the question is name a extravagant book character or a character that leads an extravagant life. And for some reason the first character that came to my mind, who maybe isn't the most extravagant, but extravagant in a way that I think a lot of us admire and aspire to in a way, is a character from the Inkart series, and it's the aunt of our protagonist, who's called Eleanor. So if you've read the books, you will know how many books she has, the way she treats them. You know, she's obsessed with her books, with special editions of books, with keeping her books pristine. So yeah, I don't know, I thought that was quite an interesting and specific way of being extravagant, so yeah, she is my answer for this question. The second question relates to the art movement of Impressionism, and the question is name a book that left a lasting impression on you. And this is gonna sound very ignorant and privileged, but for me that is The Color Purple by Alice Walker, because I think this was the first book that I ever encountered, or the first piece of media really, that I feel like made me understand like as much as a white person can understand it, the way that, especially like Jim Crow America, but generally racism and all those systems in America sort of shape a person's life. And then also, while I read that book, I read that about 2 years ago now, I took a class on intersectional feminism, and that was also a very interesting perspective that I got at the same time, because in class I sort of learned the theory, and at the same time in this book I, well, saw it kind of how that plays out, the intersection of, like, in this case, gender and race, but also in a way sexuality. So yeah, this book really left a huge impression on me, and I should reread it at some point. The next question relates to Expressionism, and it is book with a very personal and specific, possibly unique outlook on the world. I'm not sure if my book really answers the question. It's actually two books, and it's actually originally a podcast, but I would say the Welcome to Night Vale novels. If you have encountered the podcast, or maybe you've read one of the books, you will know that the world these stories are set in are very strange, and in a way the town of Night Vale is every conspiracy theory combined, and it's true and no one really cares. So yeah, I don't know, I just kind of thought of these two. As I said, it's actually it's based on a podcast. All of those things are fantastic, and if you've never listened to the podcast, you should do that, and if you've listened to the podcast but you haven't read the books, you should do that. Yeah, so but that is my answer for that question. These books have a very, very specific and interesting view of the world. Question number 4 relates to the art movement of Surrealism, and I could have also mentioned Welcome to Night Vale here, because I mean that is these books. But the question in general is a book that puts a spin on the reality of our living, or a sci-fi book that you'd recommend. So I'm going with the sci-fi book. I don't really love sci-fi. I don't even know if I'm right at classifying this book as sci-fi, but I think I am. And that is The Girl with All the Gifts by Emma Carey. I read this last year and I was surprisingly gripped by the story, so I don't even really want to say a lot about it. I mean, there is a film which I haven't seen, but you know, if you see the trailer you kind of know what the book is about. But I think it's so cool going into this not really knowing what it's about, but it's basically all I do want to say about it to answer this question is that it's a sort of post-apocalyptic.
So Ru tells us that we have to make a post-apocalyptic outfit, and I don't know what that means.
It's a sort of post-apocalyptic novel. So I was not expecting to be this much gripped by this novel. but I was. And I think what made this so fascinating was that, contrary to most other like post-apocalyptic stories that I know, you don't follow a group of people or a single person, I don't know, who tries to survive and fight off something bad, like some outer evil. But here you sort of have a zombie story where the zombie is sort of your protagonist, which I thought was just brilliant. So it's just not just a sci-fi novel that I would recommend, but it's also, I think, a sci-fi novel, or like a novel that works with the genre of zombie story. I don't even know if zombie stories would be considered like sci-fi. I don't know shit. But I think this kind of puts a bit of a twist on the genre, which I thought was fascinating and amazing. So yeah, that's my answer for this question. It's a really good book. The next question relates to the art movement of Pointillism, and the question is, a book where different narratives make a bigger picture. I feel like I really need to reread it. I don't think I'm going to be able to reread it this year, but I do need to reread it. And that is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. I've also seen someone call this a short story collection rather than a novel. I would consider it a novel, where you just jump around in time a lot. You sort of have a cast of recurring characters, but you see them in different points of their lives, and you don't really figure out everything that happened in between the chapters, before another chapter or after another chapter. And I think in that way it makes a very, very interesting picture, because you have to fill a lot of gaps yourself, and you also have to create the chronology yourself, because I think you start in like 2004, then you go to 2007, then you go to the 80s, then you go to the 90s, something like that. Like, you jump around in time a lot, and you have to understand the order and the things that are not mentioned at all. So I thought that was just fascinating. It's such a good book, and yeah, this is my Pointillism answer. The next question is connected to the art movement of pop art, and the question is, a book that criticizes consumerism in some way, or makes you look critically at current times. I had a lot of struggles thinking about a book that specifically addresses consumerism. The only one that I could come up with was a book that I hated. I hated so much. I had to read that for class. Interestingly enough, the same class that I had to read this one for, but I loved Visit from the Goon Squad, and I hated Super Sad Love Story, I think is the title, by Gary Steingard. It's a super stupid, horrible, awful book that I don't understand why I had to read that shit. But yeah, I hated that novel. But it's sort of set in somehow a close future where everyone is even more consumeristic than we are now, and I don't know, that was the only one that I could really come up with, but I hated that book. And so for the other part of the question, which is less specific, like makes you look critically at current times, I read a lot of books that make me look critically at current times, but I think the one, like if I just have to single out one, I would go with Citizen: An American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, because I think the majority of the books that I read that make me look critically at current times are non-fiction books, and this one is sort of creative non-fiction, sort of poetry, and I think because of that you get to see the psychological side of like the impacts that racism has on people who experience it. You see that in a kind of different way than you would in a non-fiction text, because this one, as I said, is poetry. It's partially like creative non-fiction because it relates to things that actually happened. You know, where is the line between fiction and non-fiction in some parts? But yeah, this one does that in a very fascinating way that I think makes my brain work differently and relate to the text differently than it does when I read non-fiction, if that makes any sense. I hope it does. The next question is Dadaism, a weird book or a book that puts a spin on the novel format. Now, one of the weirdest books I've ever read in my life is Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. I read this about 2 years ago at this point, and I still don't really know if I liked it or not, because it's just so weird. And if you've read this book yourself, you will probably know what I mean. I mean, maybe there are even weirder Murakami books, I don't know, I've only read this and another one. But when I read this, this was a type of book I'd never encountered before, and when I think about it now, I'm still extremely weirded out by it. So this is my Dadaism answer. It's a bizarre book. The next question, or sort of the last standard question really, is performance art a book that would make a great film or your favorite play? Now, I do love the theatre, but I don't like reading plays, so those plays that I've seen, most of them I haven't read. Those plays that I've read I didn't particularly enjoy because I just don't really like reading plays. But a book that I think would make an amazing film is a book about films, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I didn't adore this book as much as everyone else did. I will talk about that more in my recent reads video, but that mostly has something to do with the frame story, sort of. And I feel like in a film you could do that better than a novel, at least like a novel at this length is able to do. And I think this would make a fantastic film. I think that this would make a really, really, really good film. And I hope that someone is on it. Okay, and then there are also 2 bonus questions, both of which I think are really interesting. The first one is a fiction book that discusses, features art in some ways. I chose sort of 2 books for this question because neither of them are novels, so it's both. I mean, with one you could argue about it, but I would call both of these short story collections. The first of them is, I would say this is like also interconnected short stories. It's A History of the World in 10.5 Chapters by Joanne Barnes. There is one chapter, one short story sort of, that discusses a painting that is also printed in here. So you have a page with like a colour print of the painting, and the chapter sort of discusses the story around it, discusses sort of the myth, asks the question about the realism and the authenticity of the painting. So I thought that was just very interesting. So that is like one short story, sort of. This is not exactly answering the question, but I don't really care. And then another short story collection which also has one story which discusses a painting that I thought was fantastic was The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jane Campion. I also didn't love this, but there was one short story that was like one of my favorites, one of the ones that I thought were really strong. I can't remember the exact title, so I'm gonna have to read that out. It was Margaret and Mary at the End of the World. That chapter, in that chapter you have the protagonist who goes to the Tate Britain and she looks at a painting of something with Jesus, like Mary knowing that she's pregnant, something relating to that. And it's just a really, really well done short story, and I think it works really well with the whole thing of discussing a painting in fiction. So yeah, that is my second sort of short story that discusses art. Neither of these were novels, but I don't care. And then the last question is favourite artist and or favourite painting. I don't think I really have like one favourite artist or one favourite painting. There are a lot of things that I find amazing. But a painting that sort of always stands out a bit more maybe for me is a painting by René Magritte, which is called The Lovers, I believe. It's such an amazing painting and it makes me feel a lot of things. So yeah, I suppose this might be one of my all-time favourite paintings, but I generally really love looking at art, especially like turn of the century, like late 19th century, early 20th century art. That's my jam. I love that shit. But I think the Magritte painting might be one of my, like, might be very high up on that list. These were all my answers for the art movement book tag. I will tag some people in the description. In case you're not mentioned there but you still want to answer the questions, please go ahead and do so. I think these are fantastic questions. I love sort of that they connect, as I said at the beginning of the video, they connect literature and visual art, which I think is just fantastic. So if you like art and you think these questions are interesting, please, please, please go ahead and answer them. Thank you again, Miriam, for tagging me. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!